Is it okay to be sexist to J.K. Rowling for being a transphobe? Or, to put it in a more broad way, is it okay to be sexist to someone who is spouting transphobic rhetoric? Or, to put it less broadly, can you Angel 1 a Borg queen? Sorry, Star Trek in joke, it's a thing on this channel, you'll pick up on it if you're new here. But jokes aside, this question of can you be sexist to transphobes is an issue that got raised recently after J.K. Rowling screenshotted and commented on YouTube streamer Vaush's following tweet.
All J.K. Rowling had to do was shut the fuck up and she could have been almost uncritically beloved for like a century. Women be quieter and start apologizing challenge.
In response to the tweet, Rowling herself stated,
"What you and your ilk fail to appreciate is how tremendously familiar I find your tactics. I had a violent ex-husband who used to tell me life would be great if only I'd comply, but you're making the same mistake he did. Women like me can't be bullied out of resistance."
Basically, Rowling does what she typically does in these situations and used Vaush's tweet as evidence that trans people and our allies are misogynistic, reinforcing to herself and her audience that she is capital R right in attacking trans people. She does this pretty much all the time. There's numerous examples on her Twitter thread which should be on the screen right now. So this is particularly nothing new. But what makes this interesting, especially as someone who's also in the YouTube sphere, is that Vaush, who is a left-leaning streamer, for his part, defended his tweet in a few interesting ways, sparking a conversation about how we push back against transphobia and transphobic movements that J.K. Rowling is currently a part of and one of the most prominent voices in. And I think it's an interesting discussion worth breaking down. Now, this conversation could be as simple as saying, well, sexism is bad and you shouldn't do it regardless of the circumstance. And I 100% agree with that statement. But I do think to limit the discussion to just sort of that statement would not engage with people who disagree with that stance. So I want to look at and engage with the question overall and how people are talking about it and justifying it, because I think there are interesting points to be made and nuance to be had. Because I will say, when I watched Vaush's defense of the tweet, I actually agreed with Vaush on how he understands how transphobic systems are utilized and weaponized in order to justify and signal to an audience that transphobia is acceptable, and something that J.K. Rowling is doing quite often. However, I think he misses the mark in understanding the difference between how these optic-based politics are thought of and utilized by those pushing them, and those who these tactics are speaking to, and what the difference is between those two things. And so as a result, I want to have a conversation about this issue, not necessarily me dictating to you what my beliefs are, but just sort of tell you what my thoughts on this are in order to create that broader discussion. However, before we get into that, two things. First, this video is going to take as a given that J.K. Rowling is transphobic and has done harm to the trans community. If that is something that you disagree with, let me recommend these two videos of mine that go into why I disagree with that, and the links to those videos are below. However, to give current context to this past week in which Vaush's tweet was made was a particular highlight when it comes to J.K. Rowling expressing transphobia and transphobic narratives. Half of her Twitter feed these past few days was directed at trans people, mostly stemming, it seems, from the discussion around the appeals case of Maya Forstarter, the woman who was not rehired after she spread transphobia in her work Slack and attacked trans people online, for whom Rowling spoke up about at the start of her transphobia controversy several years ago. Additionally, on top of that though, Rowling also spread misinformation about proposed reforms to gender recognition laws in Scotland. Further, this weekend, Rowling also positively interacted on Twitter with Caroline Farrow, the director of Citizen Go, which campaigns directly against not only trans rights, but gay marriage and abortion rights as well. So Rowling, at the time which Vaush made his tweets, was particularly being mired in transphobia on Twitter. Now, I'm going to do a long video down the line that focuses on how that type of gender-critical / TERF radicalization occurs that J.K. Rowling is displaying, but I wanted to at least give context for which this conversation is happening right now. So not only has J.K. Rowling been expressly harmful to trans people, she has continued to creep further into more and more direct harm, using her platform to give attention to hate movements, political misinformation, and promote harmful people. So that's the context that we're currently talking about J.K. Rowling in, but there is another context that I wish to just sort of give voice to before we get started on the actual discussion. Because there is this current discourse and view within left-leaning YouTube spaces of supposedly video essayists like myself as somehow being against what we would term debate bro live streamers, represented by folks like Vaush. Now, I'm not going to hide the fact that I do have criticisms of the debate bro sphere, most of which are in alignment with YouTuber FD Signifier's views that he expressed in his video Breaking Bad. Sorry, Breaking Bread, not Breaking Bad. FD Signifier did not make Breaking Bad. Did totally very different things. I meant his video Breaking Bread. However, that being said though, to say that I ubiquitously hate every part of debate bro content or hate specific debate bros would be an inaccurate framing. I have respect for many of those creators, and even more specifically, this video is not here to attack or address debate bros within this video. Not to mention that I also have issues with video essayist culture as well. Also, that isn't what this video is about. I have opinions on Vaush specifically too, both positives and negatives, but I'm also not going to be talking about that in this video. And firstly, it's because I find that framing of video essayists versus debate bros to be unhelpful and unnuanced and just creates infighting, not conversations. I think that there's a much larger conversation to be had about that sort of difference between these two spaces and the issues with both. But even more importantly, secondly, I'm not interested in Vaush specifically here with the discussion in this video. My goal here is more just to spark a conversation that Vaush currently is a part of and represents, and to try to build a conversation that is constructive rather than adversarial. This is not my takedown video of Vaush or anything like that, nor am I ever probably going to make a video like that, but it is just my video to discuss dynamics of trying to address transphobia expressed by gender critical folks like J.K. Rowling, who are themselves part of a hate movement targeting trans people. So if you're here from Vaush's audience, I welcome you to disagree with me, because this should be a conversation, and don't take this as jessiegender takes down Vaush. I am so incredibly disinterested in that sort of online discourse because it's ultimately missing the point. I'm just using this instance and Vaush's arguments as examples of how these things are discussed in larger context. He's just the most recent example and the most directly pertinent to the space that I'm in as a fellow YouTuber. But with all those caveats out of the way, let's actually take a look at Vaush's arguments here surrounding supporting tweets like this towards J.K. Rowling.
J.K. Rowling, not a great person. Beefed with me on Twitter. You see, there I was innocently tweeting out misogynistic stuff on International Women's Day. All J.K. Rowling had to do was shut the F up. I see you, YouTube. And she would have been almost uncritically beloved for like a century. Women be quieter and start apologizing challenge. Phenomenal stuff. The joke here being, of course, that a common slogan for women's liberation is women be loud, stop apologizing, a sentiment which I agree with. In most cases, unless you're J.K. Rowling. So, ironic misogyny, send tweet, very funny, haha, Vaush problematic, I get it, Acting as though I was being misogynistic directly to J.K. Rowling as opposed to tweeting about the billionaire author just indirectly, right? Like, just to be clear on what we're talking about here, we are just talking about tweets thrown into the ether, which she screenshotted. So not to say that doesn't mean it's not misogynistic or whatever, but there are people in my subreddit who are like, where was that thread? Because I scroll through it, right? Where it was like, Vaush really messed up the optics on this one. He really couldn't have handled this one worse. Oh yeah, Vaush handled the J.K. Rowling drama poorly. I don't know how I could handle it poorly because there wasn't really drama. I just tweeted something and then she screenshotted it, like they're presupposing her screenshotting it as though that was something I anticipated. Like, can you imagine if everything we all said or did was subjected to the optical scrutiny of being screenshotted by somebody with 14 million Twitter followers? Like imagine anytime anyone on the left posts anything like, oh, well, you better watch out. You might get screenshotted by J.K. Rowling.
So number one, he's arguing here that his intention for the tweet was not for it to be seen by her, but that he was originally tweeting it ironically as a joke for others to sort of reinforce this idea that J.K. Rowling shouldn't be speaking up about trans issues because she's a transphobe, using kind of sexist jokes and rhetoric in order to portray that. However, after he tweeted that, J.K. Rowling was looking around Twitter for people to point to and say, hey, look at this man being sexist towards me. Aren't all trans people and their allies just misogynistic? And Vaush argues that she was going to be looking for that all the same in order to fuel her narrative. It's something that she's done over and over and over again, and his was just the most recent one. She basically is using Vaush's tweet like she's used a bunch of other tweets in a sort of optical battle. One that frames trans people and our allies as inherently sexist, and that trans women like me are somehow wielding misogyny in order to attack the quote-unquote true victims, namely the narrow amount of people that J.K. Rowling labels as women. We'll talk a little bit more about what I mean by that in just a little bit. But Vaush essentially states that his tweet was ironic and meant for a different audience than what it was co-opted for by Rowling, and wasn't even directed at her, which would have had different implications if he knew that it was going to be retweeted by her. And here, Vaush is actually 100% correct. The goal of TERF movements, and many sort of right-wing movements that attack marginalized groups, is to try to frame the discussion in a new way, as in this case, women versus trans women, who they see as and state are just men. It's basically trying to create a cultural rhetoric and framing where trans women are made to seem at direct odds with the rights of cisgender women. For example, TERFs will argue and say things like, gender ideology is taking away the rights of women. But this is, in fact, a false framing because it ignores how trans women face similar issues as cisgender women do. Both transgender and cisgender women, for example, face high levels of sexual assault, discrimination in the workplace, or ignorance of our healthcare needs. These issues often overlap for trans women and cisgender women, though sometimes presenting in different ways for each group. But on top of that, trans women and trans people in general will also face additional challenges stemming from misogyny, but also transphobia and misinformation about trans people. So the issue and the real framing in reality isn't trans women versus women, but women, trans and cisgender, facing systems that make invisible issues of misogyny and transphobia as well. But J.K. Rowling and other gender-critical women have defined women as only through the lens by which they experience it, as only the misogyny that she, as a white cisgender upper-class woman, has faced. Which, to be fair, she most definitely has faced. I mean, honestly and truly, my heart breaks to hear the story of J.K. Rowling's sexual assault, for example, and I wish it was something that she never had to face. She definitely has suffered misogyny within our world today. But that being said, the pain and suffering that she has faced as a woman is not the only way that women can be harmed. And trans women may face similar things and sexual assault like Rowling did, but also further things as well that are specific to trans people. Regardless though, gender-critical women and Rowling and hate movements like this try to frame the discussion this way, around one version of womanhood and one version of womanhood alone, defining womanhood only in that way, and often stemming out of a traumatic situation that they may have faced, using it to justify that this is the only way that a woman can be because, look, I face misogyny too. So in order to reinforce that worldview, Rowling and many gender-critical folks will look online for people enacting sexism in trans people's names, trans or not, to misrepresent trans people as misogynistic in order to reinforce their only point that trans people are inherently misogynistic and don't understand what it's like to really be a woman in their mind. So Vaush is 100% correct when he articulates that in his video. But then he continues his argument with this
misogynistic shitpost, and I feel like if they got targeted by Rowling, we wouldn't be hand-wringing like this. Like, in ContraPoints' video on J.K. Rowling, she went over tweets of people being, like, really aggressive towards J.K. Rowling, like death threats and stuff, you know? And while Contra acknowledged that these were, like, harmful and bad, you know, she didn't really seem to want to focus the video on a condemnation of that behavior because, as she stressed, right, J.K. Rowling is a billionaire with incredible social power. In a way, you're really doing her a favor by pretending that tweeting something problematic with her name involved in it is somehow a concession given to her point. Like, let me give you guys a hint, all right? J.K. Rowling doesn't care about misogyny. You can read her books. They're not exactly, like, super progressive. She doesn't care. She cares about trans people and oppressing them. That's the thing she cares about. And this whole TERF movement is really just a conservative psyop with a very small minority of second-wave feminists being signal boosted by conservative media. Are there, like, mainstream feminist, like, you know, groups that are advocating for TERF stuff? Some, yeah, but overwhelmingly, when J.K. Rowling says something transphobic and gets retweeted, signal boosted, has videos made about them, it's from conservatives. People who are often fascists. I mean, a lot of these people think women should be barefoot and pregnant. J.K. Rowling doesn't denounce the support because J.K. Rowling doesn't care that it's coming from them. She cares about support for her transphobia. So, a couple of points to that effect. First of all, conservatives don't care about misogyny. The only reason they prop up TERFs is because, well, it's the same reason they prop up Candace Owens, right? And Candace Owens accuses the Democrats of being racist, while herself never criticizing or condemning the much more overt racism from the Republicans. It's a shield. It's a way of using woke language to form a wedge against, progressive politics, a way of separating people by invoking contrary language to defend a conservative talking point.
So moving on from this, his next point is that Rowling and those who use TERF movements don't actually care about misogyny at all, but they just wield these movements and rhetoric optically to feed their more right-wing and often fascist movements. And again, on this point, I entirely agree with Vaush.
In fact, I did this whole video on the TERF to fascist pipeline that you should check out if you're more interested in the nuance and specifics of that discussion.
But I do think it misses how these systems and optics work and reinforce themselves and who they're ultimately for. But before we get to that, to give points to Vaush, he is right here. Many conservatives and far-right movements platform and support TERF movements because it helps further a culture war narrative of women versus trans people that we talked about before, one that ultimately feeds their goals. Take, for example, how the Heritage Foundation, which has actively supported the removal of abortion rights in the United States, has platformed TERFs before. Or how ultra-conservative anti-abortion religious groups have often attempted to fund gender-critical groups and movements. Or take how the Proud Boys, a far-right extremist terrorist group in the United States, who often argue for a return to fundamentalist gender roles for women as solely domestic, fought alongside TERFs in riots and protests against trans people. They do this because these groups understand that the framing of trans women versus women that TERFs try to push can be wielded to vilify trans people, who by our very existence deconstruct these traditionalist gender roles, so vilifying us is actually reinforcing gendered positions,
which is something that Vaush gets at this point in his video.
That conservatives don't care about misogyny, conservatives care about degeneracy. Or to put it another way, if J.K. Rowling had found a tweet being critical of her, and then had screenshotted it and then followed that up with the Avi, the profile picture of that Twitter user, and it was like a trans person with 18 septum piercings, pink hair, or like, you know, whatever else. That optically would have been as bad or worse from her side of the aisle than me being misogynistic.
And again, I entirely agree with his point here. Many conservatives automatically equate just being transgender with degeneracy, and so just looking like a stereotypical transgender woman optically, quote unquote, is bad to conservatives and is automatically seen as a bad thing. It showcases how being trans is automatically equated with something to be laughed at or vilified within conservative circles.
And then, more importantly, reinforce conservatives in power who use these culture war fights to rally their base and distract from more pertinent issues and keep themselves in power. And this tactic of vilifying trans people in order to bolster their own power and distract from other more pertinent issues is a commonly used tactic right now for conservative and right-wing movements. Take, for example, how there are numerous anti-transgender laws around the United States being pushed by conservatives so they can scare their base with dangerous transes so that their base will come vote for them in the next election, while also ignoring the need for laws for better healthcare, election reform, climate change legislation, etc., which would hurt these politicians' wallets and powerful positions. So in all this, Vaush is actually 100% correct. These groups, these conservative people, don't really care about misogyny. They're just wielding TERF rhetoric and TERF movements in order to bolster their own power and their base. But at the end of the day, does this justify wielding sexism to push back against TERFs or J.K. Rowling? To my mind, I don't think it does. And before we go further into Vaush's argument, I actually want to take a little bit of a sidestep to use a different example of a similar dynamic in order to kind of discuss the issues inherent in this whole entire framing, I think. And that example is by me asking a slightly similar but different question. Would it be okay of me, for example, to be racist to someone like Dave Chappelle for his use of transphobia? Would it be okay for me to use racist rhetoric to confront Dave Chappelle? I mean, the justification that Vaush is using against J.K. Rowling could be the same here. The conservatives who utilized Dave Chappelle's rhetoric don't care about racism. I mean, look at the fact that many right-wing folks like Ben Shapiro or Tucker Carlson came to Chappelle's defense, attacking and vilifying trans people, saying that we were just trying to cancel Chappelle. But then these same people in different places would go on to argue that systemic racist systems don't exist, for example. They also argue for legislation that would limit voting rights for people of color. It showcases the fact that they don't actually care about racism, but what they do care about is utilizing the culture war rhetoric of black people versus trans people to vilify trans people to stoke their base and gain attention for their news programs or their own power. And conservative politicians often do the same thing, railing against woke culture in order to bolster their own base. So, with that being said, that similar dynamic being in play, you could argue that my being racist toward Chappelle just confront Chappelle in a way that doesn't feed into their narrative, as Vaush argues with Rowling. But if I did do that, number one, it would feed that rhetoric because it would feed that idea that I was a trans person who was being racist toward Chappelle, feeding into that framing of black people versus trans people. It would allow the optics of the situation to be wielded to order to vilify me and trans people like me. And you know what? The thing is, they would be right to do so because I would be being racist, which is just flat out wrong. You don't get to use racism just because it's a cheap dig at someone that you disagree with. You don't get to take away someone's humanity and attack them for who they are in order to just win points in a debate. Not just because it optically is bad, but because it is actually inherently wrong, and you don't dehumanize people regardless of whether or not you agree or disagree with them. But this is something that happens to all forms of marginalized people when someone disagrees with us. The first thing that is used to attack a marginalized person is to take away their humanity through their identity. I mean, we talk about how it happens to trans people, how our humanity is taken away from us if we don't perform exactly how we're supposed to. This happens very obviously in right-wing spaces. I mean, take a look at how Caitlyn Jenner is often misgendered by right-wing people despite her constantly reinforcing transphobic and right-wing narratives and talking points. But this also happens within leftist spaces too. Take for example how when a trans person who worked as a moderator for the more left-leaning anti-work subreddit appeared on Fox News and badly articulated the position of the subreddit, leading to a temporary implosion of that subreddit. That trans person after that event was repeatedly misgendered and attacked because they didn't perform correctly or do as good a job as they were supposed to. And what this does is underline how transphobia is implicit within leftist spaces, number one, and within our culture in general, and how trans people often have to perform well in order just to get our humanity respected. And that is wrong. You can have criticisms of a person, but you don't get to use transphobia to dehumanize them in order to make a point or make them feel bad for having done something wrong or made mistakes. But before we dive into that, let me just return back to Dave Chappelle to continue on this point though. Chappelle did a lot of harm that perpetuated transphobia, as I've spoke about in my initial video on his special. But also, within that video, I also pointed out that Chappelle also did have a point when he spoke about how many privileged white LGBTQ folks will also perpetuate racism. For example, he made a really good point about how many white LGBTQ people will call the cops on him if they feel uncomfortable with a black man in their space, despite the fact that they are LGBTQ and should understand the same marginalization that he feels as a black man, or at least understand the same systems.
Then, right when you think we would fight, guess what he did? He picked up his phone and he called the police. And this thing I'm describing is a major issue that I have with that community. Gay people are minorities until they need to be white again.
He makes an excellent point how racism can still thrive within LGBTQ spaces, as I talked about with trans people and transphobia in left-leaning spaces. It showcases how Dave Chappelle, while his rhetoric is wielded by right-wing movements in order to attack and vilify trans people, does actually care about and have salient points about racism and how it appears in different areas and groups. However, the mistake and problem that he made was that he framed this whole conversation in a way that ubiquitized all trans people and all LGBTQ people as, one, monolithically white, ignoring that trans people of color exist and are also intersectionally marginalized, and two, flattened the entire trans community as simply racist, misunderstanding how often LGBTQ people, white or not, often work in coalition with black movements and vice versa. He also misunderstood how racism can be systemic and both perpetuated and fought against within communities and even within singular people. How people can express racist ideas but also push back against racism at the same time, because humans are complex and contradictory in numerous ways. It's a complex interplay and conversation about how racism, both personal and systemic, still exists within all marginalized spaces, communities, or movements, and yet cannot simply be stated as all racist or not racist, nor erase the intersectionality of the people involved, which Chappelle did do, framing race, sexuality, and gender as all separate forces that don't ever interact with each other, and him prioritizing racial issues that he faced as a black man above all others, ignoring how it would be faced for a trans black woman, for example. But in reality, it doesn't have to be a hierarchy, and also these forces like gender, sexuality, and race intersect with each other in different ways that privilege some and disenfranchise others. And so we can bring that same idea and talk about it with J.K. Rowling. The whole intent of TERF/gender critical rhetoric, as I said before, is to frame the issue of trans people versus women, framing misogyny as the singular concern that women face in their minds, without recognizing the intersection of how trans women face both transphobia and misogyny, and that this transphobia and misogyny presents itself in ways both similar to and different from how cis white women would experience the same thing. This isn't to say that misogyny that J.K. Rowling and TERFs like her have faced isn't legitimate, but ignores that trans people, like myself, have also faced sexual assault, face higher degrees of assault in general, and also have added transphobic harassment and attacks on our rights and physical bodies for being trans as well. What it does is showcase how, like Dave Chappelle, actually does care about racism, but misses the intersectionality of it, how gender-critical folks like J.K. Rowling do care about misogyny, but miss how it actually represents in marginalized groups other than themselves. So to weaponize sexism in the name of trans women not only ignores that trans women will often suffer from that same sexism ourselves and don't wish to have it perpetuated in our name, but also feeds into this idea that trans women don't actually face sexism, and how that gets wielded by folks like J.K. Rowling to paint all trans supportive people and trans people as sexist misogynists and actually men, which she can then use to argue that trans women don't experience sexism because she rightly knows that those who experience sexism will often not wish to perpetuate it, at least not overtly or intentionally. This is why the politics of optics that Vaush often focuses on sometimes misses the point of optics politics. Yes, right-wing movements and the people in charge of them don't actually believe or care about misogyny and are just using the language of defending against it in order to actually reinforce it as well as their own power. However, the people that they're speaking to, those who have been radicalized by movements like it, do actually believe in it. Rowling does concern herself with misogyny and misogynists, just only in how it affects her and people like her, not trans people or anyone else. She only sees misogyny as centering around her framing of womanhood and her version of womanhood alone. And those in conservative movements, by the way, also tend to do this same exact thing. Many conservative people may not be in reality actually fighting misogyny because they haven't been experienced or been taught how to conceive of misogyny outside of how cis upper-class white women experience it in their very limited way. They have not experienced or been taught how to conceive of misogyny outside of a cis upper-class white woman's limited experience of it, and not understand the intersectional and often systemic ways that it showcases itself. However, they do believe that they are fighting misogyny because quick sexist tweets are easy for them to square with their limited understanding of what sexism and misogyny is. They see sexism as simply like dudes saying sexist things and devaluing women, like saying babe on Twitter, like how Rowling herself got all upset about this tweet. Rowling's not really worried about intersectional or systemic misogyny because she's never really had to experience it or understand it, or how it affects trans people. But she is concerned about a very narrowed view of what misogyny is. So it's not that people in these movements don't care about misogyny, it's that they don't understand the true scope of what misogyny actually is within our systemically unjust society. So then, to wield that exact type of sexism against J.K. Rowling just reinforces the whole narrative that she works under, that trans women aren't women because they don't face this type of misogyny that she faces, and that trans women are actually just perpetuating that same misogyny that she's pushing against. Further, it allows her to reinforce to herself that she is correct because she creates this bubble of virtue around herself, retweeting genderqueer women who thank her for standing up for women everywhere, from the big bad sexist trans women and our allies, because those women too only understand misogyny in the same limited way. She's not actually forced to confront the harm she causes to trans people because she's not even able to empathize or conceptualize it. By feeding this narrative then, it flattens the discourse into binarized and easily comprehensible good versus evil concepts for J.K. Rowling and those movements, rather than the actual human and messy discussion that it is to talk about intersectional and systemic misogyny and racism and transphobia and things like that. It doesn't allow J.K. Rowling or TERFs to actually wrestle with the cognitive dissonance their transphobia would cause if they were forced to see how their attacks actually reinforce misogyny and transphobia at the same time. And so all of this comes back to Vaush's arguments, because he does argue that the goal of him doing tweets like this to use sexism against J.K. Rowling is to trigger and upset her. That it shows someone as big as J.K. Rowling is getting upset at a small-time YouTuber like Vaush, and that is worthwhile and important.
And by the way, Rowling never would have screenshotted me if I wasn't misogynistic, so the people who are acting as though me being more in good faith would have led to like people are acting as though I was on a talk show with Rowling where I had the opportunity to say something constructive and I chose not to. If that was the case, I think any criticisms of me would be massively warranted because there's the potential for good faith engagement. But I was just tweeting, you know? She can screenshot and has screenshotted whoever she wants. She has quote tweeted trans people with like 500 followers, and those people then get death threats. They have to close their accounts. She didn't quote tweet me though. She screenshotted me. I wonder why. It's funny that, you know, I can take the hate a lot better than most of the people she harasses can. The point is she goes looking for the bad look to go after. And as long as she's prowling around, and you know she does this, she drinks wine, she sits on her, no doubt, massive couch that costs more than most people's houses. And she scrolls through Twitter on her phone and she bemoans how much of a victim she is. And she finds people who are saying mean stuff about her and she like cry bullies over them, right? I would rather, if she was going to do that anyway, do that about me, because if I hadn't said something misogynistic, she would have just done it to somebody else and you wouldn't be wringing your hands over it because it wouldn't have been me, you know? I swear to God, for a lot of people on the left, disliking me is some kind of first order thing. The only point that I'm making is that it's okay to criticize the ironic misogyny, but the idea that this is some kind of optical loss, that there was some critical error made, or that I handled the drama incorrectly, as though every tweet that I, a medium-sized YouTuber, send into the void should be treated with the necessary skepticism of you will be quote tweeted and screenshotted by a billionaire. Like, that's ridiculous. Imagine if we did that to every single person posting on the left, every shit poster, every edgy content creator. The Chapo boys have said stuff like, imagine, like, would you, if the Chapo boys said some, I have no doubt they've said negative stuff about Rowling. I have no doubt they've said like problematic stuff about, you know, a great many conservative people, because I've seen and heard them do it. Sometimes they're even funny when they do it. Imagine like that snippet getting posted. Look at these Chapo boys. Wow, I guess, you know, I guess the left really is racist. Or maybe they made some edgy comment about like Candace Owens or something. I don't know. Would you all go, damn, Chapo boys really dropped the ball optically? No, you wouldn't. You would celebrate them being a shit poster and you would make fun of the triggered right. And why aren't more people doing that? J.K. Rowling got triggered by me. She's a crybaby bitch. She's a massive baby. She's a billionaire with huge social power. And she was out there getting angry at some mid-sized YouTuber on Twitter for engaging in, you know, fairly light-handed misogyny. I can be way more misogynistic than that, okay? I had the kid gloves on. I can get, I'll get me a real platform, okay? I'll show you.
So to start off, I do understand his point that if it wasn't his tweet that got Rowling upset, it would have been someone else's. So to single out Vaush's tweet as an issue as if he could have anticipated it being used by Rowling is probably unfair. However, I don't really think saying, well, other people were doing it too, and doing it worse than me, is ultimately a strong argument in favor of perpetuating the same problem. It doesn't address the issue at hand and just hand waves it away. So, moving on to his stronger points.
He's not incorrect in the effects of his tweet. It certainly shows that Rowling is irrationally focused on finding examples in which to stoke her base and narrative. And that is kind of interesting to show how disingenuous she actually is and not willing to engage with what trans people are actually saying, because she doesn't actively seek it out. But we already knew that. We already knew that J.K. Rowling was doing that. So I ultimately wonder what Vaush's tweet is ultimately serving in the long run. Quick little pause and apology here, because for some reason at this point in the video, this mic turned off. So while I was editing, I'm like, oh shoot, the audio quality dips here. So apologies that the audio after this section is a little bit wonky, but I did my best to try to beef it up and make it sound as best as possible. So apologies for the change in audio quality here. It just happens when you talk for a long time on camera that mics decide to be a butt, like this guy. Big butt. It's a butt of a microphone. His ultimate point is to say that making these kind of jokes is ultimately not to care about what Rowling and her followers will think about it, because to his mind, they don't care about it, which I already stated that I disagree with and ultimately find it harmfully feeding their narrative, though I do see where he's coming from and where he gets that idea. But that his point is that he's making it for his audience. And so that raises the question, is the harm of making tweets like this and how they're utilized by folks like J.K. Rowling outweighed by the benefit to a more trans-supportive and left-leaning audience? And to my money, I would say not. Because what these types of jokes do and what they're sort of speaking to within an audience that Vaush is cultivating is falling into that type of trigger the libs sort of discourse that the right wing uses. Except in this case, it's the trigger the TERFs. As we see from the same type of joke being used by conservatives, it's often done in order to double down on takes that are there to upset your opponent and then reinforce to your audience that they are actually correct because your takes are upsetting your opponents, which is what you ultimately frame as the right thing to do. That the goal of your tactic should be to upset and only upset your opponents and that you're winning the argument, rather than actually trying to constructively engage with these conversations. It's just reinforcing to your own audience their sense of virtue without actually doing anything constructive or adding to the conversation. Further, it also lends a discussion into why your audience is desiring sexist takedowns in the first place instead of a more nuanced perspective that you're supposed to be providing. And I get it. Vaush is saying that this was just an ironic joke. I get that. But if I started saying ironic racist jokes, wouldn't we all take issue with that? Because we have talked about enough in the past few years how irony is often used to disguise tacit acceptance of these views within our spaces. When conservatives do trigger the libs types jokes, it's ultimately reinforcing their bubbles and stoking them into their worst impulses because they know that type of over-the-top heightened versions of themselves upsets the other side, which they see as winning the argument because they've just upset the other side. But then, that more over-the-top cartoonish version, caked in irony, starts to become more and more acceptable as the actual position because it instead frames being upsetting over being actually correct in your views.
And by the way, the wonderful YouTuber Jose did a recent video about how this type of conservative comedy ultimately reinforces conservatives' worst impulses, and you should totally check it out because the dynamic that we're talking about here is the same within conservative circles.
Now, this isn't me trying to say that Vaush is trying to say to his viewers that sexism is okay, or that he's trying to be this more over-the-top cartoonish version, but what I'm saying is that sending tweets like this does cultivate an audience and a discourse where these sort of statements become more and more permissible and allowable over time. If I made a racist joke about Chappelle, it would tacitly say to my audience that I'm okay with racist jokes at all times, and that sort of rhetoric is more and more acceptable in my space, even if I'm not explicitly condoning racism. Again, this is not me saying that Vaush is responsible for the actions of every single one of his audience or how they view and interpret every single one of his tweets. That would be unfair and ridiculous of me, especially as someone with myself, with an own audience, and understanding how audiences sometimes misinterpret what you're saying and how you have to be very clear and intentional with that. But what he is responsible for is how he models behavior to his audience and builds what is acceptable in his audience's space. And the fact that he is doing these types of tweets speaks to the still inherent misogyny, not necessarily within Vaush, but within leftist spaces in general, just as there are racist and transphobic elements within leftist spaces as well, as we talked about earlier. Again, it's all nuanced and intersectional. This isn't me calling Vaush a racist, sexist, transphobe, nor does it erase that he is often outspoken to fight those issues on numerous occasions. But what it does say is that he can also perpetuate those things too. Just as, by the way, I can as well. For example, in some of my early videos on this channel where I was still learning how to make content, I did racist jokes without really understanding that they were offensive and hurtful and ultimately reinforced racism within my space. It wasn't my intention. I wasn't trying to be racist, but making jokes about people's names and not being able to pronounce them does reinforce these sort of racist ideas that center a white experience over other marginalized experiences. Even further, something that I've been trying to dismantle in my content very much lately is the centering of just transgender issues above all others, instead of positioning it as part of the complex system that intersects with many other elements and issues. And so me all saying this isn't an indictment of Vaush, at least on this issue, but more a look at how the issue is much more than Vaush good or Vaush bad, but implicates all of us in it, myself included, and how these issues are inherent within leftist spaces, as well as just, our society in general, because it's built off of sexism, racism, and transphobia, as well as numerous other things, like ableism or anti-fatness.
And to be fair to Vaush, in the clip that I showed earlier, he did make the concession that there were criticisms to be had of his ironic misogyny in his tweet.
The only point that I'm making is that it's okay to criticize the ironic misogyny, but the idea that this is some kind of optical loss, that there was some critical error made, or that I handled the drama incorrectly, as though every tweet that I, a medium-sized YouTuber send into the void should be treated with the necessary skepticism of you will be quote tweeted and screenshotted by a billionaire. Like, that's ridiculous.
But he ultimately seems to consider that a sidestep for his larger concern about the optics surrounding talking about J.K. Rowling in this way, and that he could have done misogyny even worse if he had wanted to, as he states in that video. I think he's ultimately missing the point that if that's his argument, that he's making these tweets for his own audience, that he should be aware of what the ramifications are within his own audience, as well as, to a lesser degree, as he himself admits, what the audience on the other side would think about the tweet as well. Not to mention how tweets like this will make trans people and women feel within his space.
Ultimately, if you're making tweets like this for your audience, I kind of feel that all it does is reinforce sexism implicitly within leftist spaces, which also then leads to acceptance of transphobia as well. This is not saying that Vaush is saying or doing that intentionally, or that he's an awful person, or that I disagree with him on every single issue because he's a debate bro and oh my god, they're the worst. It's not what I'm saying. But that it speaks to a larger problem that we need to begin dismantling within our own spaces, while at the same time trying to make sure we don't reinforce it within the people that we're trying to push back against, which these tweets often do with folks like J.K. Rowling.
Also, I'll briefly mention that in his video, Vaush also argued about what he saw people were arguing against him, basically stating this.
The people who are hand-wringing over this are borderline defending J.K. Rowling by implication. So the people who are fretting over this are essentially siding with the transphobe, either because their optics or civility politics brained in a very liberal fashion, or because they hate me so much that they have to adopt any position which allows them to condemn me. And it may seem self-centered to say that, but like there's a lot of that on the left.
Now, that's a larger conversation that I could get into with this video, but I'm not going to really touch upon it because I actually don't think my criticism in this video are actually stemming from those places that he's stating there. I think I've made very clear that I do not agree with J.K. Rowling in any way, shape, or form, and I'm not really worried about the optics of that appearance, but more just how it's actually reinforcing these issues within J.K. Rowling herself and her audience. That I'm not worried about optics necessarily in a way that he's talking about in terms of like a liberal mindset of like we need to be nice to the transphobes, but more just that this sort of dynamic is ultimately reinforcing these issues to these people and not actually helping a audience on our side as well. It's not really making an argument for either audience in any way that's constructive or helpful. And secondly, I hope I've made very, very clear that this video is not just made to take down Vaush just because I dislike Vaush for some reason. I don't dislike Vaush completely and totally, and this video is not just to dislike and hate on Vaush just because it's Vaush. However, I will say I do take umbrage with the fact that he paints pretty much all opposition to his stance in these lights, when I hope is made clear, and other people have made clear on Twitter and in other spaces, that there is honest critique of Vaush's tactics and words.
But even further, what I especially dislike about this whole conversation is having to do this video in this first place. How I'm frustrated that this conversation about trans people is currently being centered around a cis woman and a cis man. It's deeply frustrating that the conversation around and about trans people rarely includes trans people within it. This is not Vaush's fault, because it's often what typically happens when trans issues are discussed at all. Trans people rarely get listened to in conversations that directly affect us. So my goal here is to offer this video in good faith criticism and use this specific instance as a way to talk about how these issues appear everywhere, not just with Vaush. And I offer it up so that all of you can disagree with me or agree with me. I don't sit here thinking that I have the moral dictation on everything here, but more just wanting to create that conversation. I will admit that there is a fear with me having made this video and centering it around Vaush as an example of it, that it might just devolve into our audiences attacking each other, like Vaush's fans attacking me or my audience going after Vaush back. But I don't want that to happen, because ultimately I know that we're all ultimately within the same spaces and that our audiences often overlap. And that there are folks who I've spoken to who are in my audience who are dealing with the complexities of the conflicts within our leftist community and are trying to reconcile them both within themselves and within their favorite creators in this space, as I myself am trying to do. I am trying myself to dismantle my own sort of centralizing of transness and wanting to reach out and try to center other voices and other identities that intersect with issues that affect me but don't directly affect me as a sort of middle-class white woman. So instead of us framing this whole conversation as, me versus Vaush or debate bros versus video essayists, let's use this instance to create conversations as best we can. And so ultimately, I wish everyone, even those who took issue with my points or felt I missed something here, I wish you all the best, and I wish to hear your thoughts, my friends. I wish you all love and appreciation, and I thank you for trying to create a constructive conversation. That all being said, thank you so much for watching this video. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, all the YouTube things. It does really actually help me out. I try my best on this channel to do sort of these nuanced discussions that don't try to create infighting, but create conversations and sort of instigate sort of thought within all of us rather than dictating what you should believe or should think. On top of that, I'm also just a giant dorky Star Trek nerd, so if you like dorky, nerdy stuff, that's also on this channel as well. I also have a secondary channel called Jessiegender After Dark, where I do news, reviews, reactions. I review every new episode of Star Trek shows, as well as a bunch of other things and movies and things like that.
I'm also available on Nebula if you wish to watch me over there. And I would also say, please check out these videos that are on screen right now, as I think they continue this conversation that we've been talking about within this video. And I think they would be good follow-ups to this if you're still interested in how, for example, TERFs ultimately support far-right and fascist movements, even if they don't intend to.
And also, I do a Bible on 5 podcast that I do with my friend Council Geeks that is linked down below. And also, an extra special thank you to my patrons to help supporting me doing what I do. I could not do this without you, so thank you so much for your support. I adore you and love you. Mwah. And beyond all of that, thank you so much for watching. Thank you for being here, and I hope that this conversation was ultimately constructive, and I wish you all a good, live long, and prosper, my friends.
Am I wearing a Peacemaker cosplay with glasses underneath the helmet? Yes, I am. Don't think anything of it, because it is time to thank my wonderful patrons. Thank you so much for supporting me doing what I do and being able to buy weird, dumb cosplays like this, and especially an extra special spanking was the word that I almost wanted to say. Extra special thank you to Morgan the Pirate Queen, Joe Herman Holt, Miranda Janelle, Liz Tivy, DJ Samuels, Catherine Lambeth, Ashley Allen, Bo Kiki Yo, Lily Gray, Stephen Kleinard, Jem Shin, Matt Chung, Mary Mello, Randy Thompson, Ellie Gober, Ish the Mad, Super Desi, D. Ray, Wellington Marcus, Boyd and Mary Beth Earl, Vincent Ellington, G-Man 42, Felicia Toast, Chloe Dollar, Joseph Dewey, Alex Miller, Sylvester Rota, Elizabeth Christensen, James Krivda, Dominic Noble, Barbara Ruski, Jennifer Fuss, Zone 1 Librarian, Jessica Wright, Suck Corgi, Sonia Nero Perdo, Neathra Fronton, Peter Landers, Frangato, Transit Toronto, Sasha M, Lee Arthur Boyd, Mountain Harpy, Celestial Dawn, When Dizzle Bizzle, Pissed and Twisted, Garage, Huh, Stephen Richardson, Melinda Walters, John Weatherby, Meadow Whisper, W, Brandy Edie, Cyber Quakey, Alyssa the Pagan, Beatrix Pruvis, Alex Owen, Kevin Frintag, Tiffany Danger, Lysa, Sean Piper, Casual Observer, Angie Pugh, Gretchen Badger Flynn, 'Cause I've got faith of the heart, 4, Maggie the Goblin, Adja Saad, Sarah Leslie Hutchkins, Jess Johnson, William Stewart, Skyscanner, Sarah Lamoureux, Sarah Bystam, Calisis, Eva Kniva, I'm sorry. Melody Ann, Winter's Good, Noble Monster Comics, Nathan Steele, Laura Demereux, Verdix Kai, Jason Knott, Hioresis, Spooky, Heather Sylvia, Troy Stull, Andrew K, Maeve, Polly Mina, Strawberry Pupter, Ashri Inda, Moo Nir Amlani, Emily Umis, Crit Fax, Nikki Gordon Bloomfield, Blade Upton, Michael Godey, Jenny Mabel, Elijah M, Ver, Bella Lugosi, Corey, and Vale Hunkanen. Woo! Thank you, every single one of you. I adore you all. Again, patrons, I could not do this without you. You let me do this and be a weird dork and just sing weird voices at the end of every video. Thank you so much, and I just appreciate you supporting me being weird and dumb and silly, and I send you my absolute love going forward. Mwah. Truly, from the bottom of my heart, you are wonderful.